Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. So today we're going to talk about holistic methods of inquiry to address 21st century problems and issues. And Ryan, thank you for that introduction. I do want to say I do want to answer all of your questions. Please do send them to Ryan. We are going to hold them to the end, and then I will address all of your questions at the end of my talk. Amid the news reports of soul-sucking actions and indifferent acts, how did we come to this? I wonder, this time of evil triumph, fake truths, embodied paralysis, ins and outcasts, proliferation of greed, and hate, and hate, and hate. And my heart hurts and worries, and I look for a place to escape, a way to understand. So I've been theorizing, writing about, teaching, and doing research methods for almost 40 years. I'm a methodologist at heart, or maybe you could say I'm a methodology nerd. I've conducted experiments and surveys, focus groups, rhetorical analyses, artifact analysis, and narrative ethnography, autoethnography, and poetic ethnography. I have seen all types of methods address all types of questions and problems. And I don't know about you, but I became a researcher, I became an academic, a scholar, to change the world for the better. And I think there has never been a time when ways of knowing have been so crucial, so critical, so necessary to understand the world as today. And I would venture to say it may not be hyperbole to claim that a new level of understanding may have the potential to save the world today. So when I'm talking about new methods, different methods, I do need to remind all of us, including myself, that all types of methods, each method has its own strengths, limitations, and appropriate uses. So as I tell my students when I teach research methods, which I do a lot, if I'm getting ready to take a medication to treat, say, cancer, I don't want to know that medication was tested with focus groups. I want to know that a rigorous, double-blind, experimental design was used to determine what effectiveness it had, what its side effects had, within a very specific margin of error, say 99%. So although I do have to also remind us that the field of medical humanities has uncovered an entirely new range of understandings of things like the embodied experience of chemotherapy through arts-based methods. I would venture to say, and to quote Patricia Levy, how we create knowledge impacts what knowledge we have. And I would add to that, how we create knowledge impacts what knowledge we find of value, what knowledge we find valuable. So today I want to suggest that we have problems that are also cancers on our society, on our community, on our people, that experiments alone, surveys alone, focus groups alone, arts-based methods alone cannot fix. We have environmental degradation about which huge swaths of people close their eyes. We have systemic economic and racial inequality about which people turn their backs. We have racism and sexism and homosexism and youthism and a multitude of other isms that are complicit in suffering and violence and marginalization. So I'm going to take one step back and suggest that when you start a research project using holistic methods, which I'm going to talk about greatly for the rest of the hour, you want to start, rather than starting with a question, maybe you want to start with a wondering. Wondering is the first step to knowledge, scholars say. So you want to start with wondering, and maybe what we're trying to do is generate wisdom instead of generating knowledge to address the problems of today. So to paraphrase a Franciscan priest, Father Richard Rohr, who heads up New Mexico's Center for Action and Contemplation, one of the problems in our scene in the world today is that we rely primarily on dual consciousness, the human tendency to separate everybody and everything into categories of us and them, and then the resulting judgment that comes from identifying someone as different from me and therefore laying on a value judgment of different, therefore not as good as me. So people seeing the world through dual consciousness see things as black and white, good and bad, us and them. So its opposite, non-dual consciousness, is what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, I'm going to define what I mean by non-dual consciousness, what I mean by holistic ways of seeing the world. Then I'm going to talk about how to conduct research through this level of consciousness. Then I'm going to talk about how to teach students to use non-dual consciousness in their own ways of thinking and knowing. So just to give you the learning objectives for today, as a result of this webinar, you will learn first how to think more holistically as you engage with research questions, wonderings, problems, participants, and data. You're going to learn how to move beyond dualistic either or thinking in your scholarship to embrace a more holistic way of knowing. You're going to learn how to become a methodological mystic who strives for dialogue, justice, and imagination in your understanding of phenomena or experiences. And you're going to learn how to engage your students to read reality truthfully, humbly, and helpfully. So historically and traditionally, scholars have used the term triangulation to refer to examining data in multiple ways: data triangulation, theoretical triangulation, researcher triangulation, and of course those are all in our Straight Talk textbook. Triangulation derives from a social science post-positivist paradigm that understands reality something to be objectively viewed and captured. So then later, qualitative researcher Laurel Richardson, and then later expanded by researcher Laura Ellingson, coined the term crystallization to use a metaphor of a crystal to refer to seeing the data through multiple lenses or multiple ways of seeing the world. Now, this concept stems from an interpretive paradigm that privileges multivocality, or multiple voices or perspectives in knowing. And both of these terms and concepts are certainly both well and good, but each derive from very specific epistemologies and stay within their own epistemological boundaries, so necessarily they have limitations. So in my 2017 textbook, Straight Talk about Communication Research Methods, published by Kendall Hunt, and also my 2014 book, Conversations about Qualitative Communication Research, Behind the Scenes with Leading Scholars, published by Routledge, and my 2015 co-authored article with Deborah Breed, published in the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry, titled Holistic Ethnography, Embodiment, Emotion, Contemplation, and Dialogue in Ethnographic Fieldwork. I theorize a method of inquiry that moves beyond triangulation and crystallization of research data to a more holistic, whole body approach to research, kind of a cross-training, if you will. This holistic technique of considering knowledge is similar to an embodied meditation practice, a conscious awareness of experience in which the researcher moves through social science, narrative, arts-based, and dialogic ways of thinking in order to intentionally and variously focus her attention on rationality and physical sensations and emotions and contemplation and dialogue to contribute to deep understanding of sense-making and a critical examination of the world. So today I'm going to talk about this way of understanding the world, holistic methods of inquiry. So I'm going to discuss how this method of engagement leads to a better consideration of social problems and issues, and I'm going to discuss the 4 stages of this process. So the 4 stages of this process: embodiment, emotion, contemplation, and dialogue. So holistic methods of inquiry stem from an analytical orientation that enables the researcher to better, completely, and critically examine cultural and social phenomenon. So again, to paraphrase Richard Rohr, it is in the places of great love and great suffering that you must see the world through non-dual consciousness. So the rational mind, says Rohr, simply cannot process concepts like love, death, suffering, infinity. Holistic methods of inquiry let you come from any initial orientation: quantitative, qualitative, critical, cultural, rhetorical, post-positivist, interpretivist, or aesthetics, to engage in a deeper, more thoughtful ways of approaching any area of study. So, as you know, there are many different ways to approach understanding a research project. And in our field of communication studies, there's several main paradigms followed by scholars, and they're listed on your PowerPoint slide. I mean, you know these paradigms: post-positivism, interpretivism, rhetorical, critical, social science, narrative, arts-based, or aesthetic paradigms. And there are strengths and weaknesses, as you know, to each position, each paradigm, and each of these paradigms influence the way you see the world and the questions you ask about the world. So, for instance, some scholars enter the experience through narrative, as Walter Fisher would say, as a homo narrans or storyteller. Others take a social science approach to research experience and more analytically, in a more linear manner. Other scholars take what Ron Pelias calls a more heartfelt approach, arts-based approach, in which they seek understanding and meaning experientially. They embody it literally through their bodies by painting it, poeticizing it, aestheticizing it. And so in this conversations book, I interviewed top 10 qualitative communication scholars to understand the backstory of how and why they conducted research using their specific method. So, for instance, I interviewed Buddy Goodall on conducting cultural ethnography. I interviewed Carolyn Ellis on autoethnography, Sarah Tracy on in-depth interviews, Jerry Phillipson on ethnography of speaking, Alan DeSantis on card sort method of analysis, Stacy Holman Jones on arts-based methods. So this book basically was an ethnography of research methods. And based on fieldwork, interviews, observations, focus groups over several years, I used case studies to help us understand, describe, and analyze qualitative communication research, offering kind of an insider's view behind the scenes of these scholars, how they make decisions, how they deal with theory, data collection, analysis, and so on. And they represent this whole range of research methods that are on your screen right there. And so the project shed light on what qualitative research really looks like in the real world. And one of the most important things that I found from this research is how 10 different scholars from 10 different orientations can approach a project, and through the decisions they make along the way, come up with 10 very different, equally valid, but very different projects. And what was most interesting to me in this book that led to the method I'm talking to you about today is to see what's gained and lost by doing each different method, each meta-theoretical type of research, or each meta-theoretical approach to knowing. And so what I ended up with when I completed this book was an idea that rather than focusing on one method only, one position, one paradigm only, what if we broadened our thinking, broadened the way we saw knowledge, broadened the way we examined knowledge, and took an approach that's more like cross-training. So I call it a whole body experience. So I suggested then and suggest now that we take from all the paradigms to conduct research by moving through the senses. So from the body to the eyes and the ears, taste and touch, to the mind, and finally to the heart. And what I'm suggesting is that only when you have immersed yourself in your research from top to bottom, inside and out, through your body, mind, and spirit, can you fully understand the experience. And so one of the most interesting takeaways from this book was to see how the body, for instance, can be experienced as a narrative and a performance and an argument. How organizational politics can be seen through a performative lens and a social science lens. How the cultural treatment of marginalized people can be understood as a story and a performance. How families can be studied through a social science understanding and a performative understanding, and how culture can be known as a narrative and from a social science perspective. And so it was in this deep examination of the various methods that I realized we have more to learn to appreciate from each other than to argue about. And so in the course of writing this book, I found some really interesting things that they have in common. So regardless of the meta-theoretical position or paradigm, good qualitative research has, and I would venture to say good research has many things in common. So one of the most interesting things I like to tell, or two of the most interesting things I like to tell my students, number one, every single scholar writes every single day. So that's kind of a motivational message for me. Write every single day. Each scholar writes multiple drafts of their research. So I like to remind students how important that is. Each scholar has an aha moment. A moment where discoveries and surprises come into their research and take it to the next level, take it into the next level of significance and importance, and deepen the thought. And so what's interesting about these aha moments is that they come from long periods of time of very deeply interacting with the data, very deeply interacting with their research participants, with the environment and the findings. And then they also come from very deeply reading theorists and reading newspapers and reading what's different mediated types of information, films, novels, by being widely read and deeply engaging in the research and the data. Suddenly, as if overnight, these aha moments come to these scholars, but the aha moments only come by being ready from deeply engaging with the world and with the research. Other things, good qualitative researchers are reflexive. They position themselves and their standpoints in their research, acknowledge their positionality and thoughtful, intelligent analysis that ties the research to larger picture, historical parallels, cultural meanings, narrative trajectories. So understanding for these researchers comes from both sides of the brain, studying the data, looking for patterns and themes, immersing themselves, as I said, in their data, discussing the findings with scholarly peers, following the evidence, trusting their gut, and as I said, being open to these aha moments. So in considering holistic methods of inquiry, we merge these positionalities. So according to Goodall, who calls us to use narrative ethnography as applied scholarship aimed at re-establishing the centrality of personal experience and identity in the social construction of knowledge, we are merging these positionalities. So Dr. Deborah Breed and I developed the idea of expanding this into a holistic method of inquiry that we suggest is similar to an embodied meditation practice. So a conscious awareness of experience in which the researcher intentionally and variously focuses her attention on physical sensations and emotions and contemplation and a dialogue to contribute to deep sense-making and critical examination. And so we suggest that we immerse ourselves in the phenomena through our mind, senses, and heart. And understanding through narrative, understanding through this holistic way of thinking requires us to focus our attention on images, smells, taste, touch, and move it into our heart, to feel deeply with it, unite with it. Contemplating with our minds lets us find meaning in it. And then engaging dialogically invites us to discuss, connect, and voice meaning into being. And so this approach is messy, but it's thorough. It leads to deep introspection and understanding, and lets you understand things at a very deep level of meaning. And so let me talk for just a second about how I use this in my research. So one of my own areas of study is in end-of-life communication. And I have in recent years studied the way in which interpersonal communication, such as in grieving families, with caring healthcare providers, and in which cultural and artifactual communication in cemeteries, monuments, memorials, tourist sites, ghost hunting, televisions, films, and songs all construct our ideas about death and dying. So moving from the micro to the macro perspectives. And I've found that being intentional to moving through these holistic methods of inquiry is necessary in this body of research, because so much of my research involves people and situations that are no longer alive, that I can no longer engage with in the present. So I'm an ethnographer by training. And I typically observe and interview living bodies to understand life, culture, and communication. But I see a lot of truth and relevance in Janicek's idea of observational impermanence, the temporal, cyclical nature of experience. And this is especially salient in the study of people and things that represent and commemorate death. So in my body of research, sometimes I've said that I'm actually studying a rhetoric of silence. So I'm studying people who are no longer there, people who can no longer speak. And so as I've walked through cemeteries and tried to understand what the experience of those long dead was like, trying to, again, as I've said, speaking the language of the dead. And so the other thing I think that's really important to remember when we do this research is that we have to acknowledge our own perceptual field. And so for me, I wear clearly white Eurocentric blinders. I wear glasses colored in privilege of education and class, economically, historically. And so sometimes it's hard for me to see literally what's right in front of my face. And especially some of my research has been with marginalized communities, with cemeteries in which people who have been historically marginalized are buried in historically marginalized areas of town. And so it's important to understand where my viewpoint, the points at which I'm coming from in my research, and recognize that. So there's these large gaps between me and the people and experiences that I'm trying to study. Holistic research lets us move in the direction of bridging these gaps to uncover things like both privilege and disenfranchisement. So, holistic methods of inquiry involve a systematic and rigorous 4-step contemplative process. These steps are not linear, but they can be more circular. But in holistic research, we are experiencing, narrativizing, emoting, contemplating, and dialoguing systematically, repeatedly, and chaotically. And so for the next little bit of this webinar, I'm going to take you through each of these steps and let you experience them yourselves. So the first step is embodied experience. You literally immerse yourself in your research topic and are intentional about experiencing it through all of your senses. And so if you're a qualitative researcher, this might take the form of qualitative observation. But if you're a more quantitatively experienced scholar, maybe you might immerse yourself in your data. So maybe you might focus on a chart or a table or a statistical finding. Or you might take the unique step of adding some observation, immersive experience. Maybe this happens as you're designing a study and as you're immersing yourself in the literature. So in this stage, in this first stage, as you observe, you take notes, but these are not traditionally oriented field notes. I call these detailed experiential notations for embodied understanding. And so these are your goals. You're looking for flashes of understanding, of finding new connections between things, seeing familiar things from a new perspective, making a shared sense of chaos and complexity and navigating within that. And so what do these notes look like? They describe what you're feeling, seeing, hearing, tasting, and smelling, both literally and metaphorically. And so if you're conducting a survey among people who've had a family member die, perhaps you would contemplate what these responses would feel like, make you feel like. Can you imagine seeing their faces, hearing their voices? In a survey, their disembodied voices. What are these disembodied voices trying to tell you? And my first boss, who was a survey researcher, I was in market research for 20 years before I moved over to academia. My first boss once told me that the day he forgot that there were people behind the numbers was the day he was going to retire. Outstanding advice. What would you consider if you remembered there were people behind those numbers? What would you see? What would you hear? What would you taste? What would you smell? What would you feel if you remembered your study participants are living, breathing, loving, suffering people? Maybe you're observing hospital interactions, which is one of the things I do. Maybe your notations would consider what memories the smells of the hospital evoke. Maybe you consider if the antiseptic smell of a hospital corridor, the cold chill of a germ-free environment evokes the same memories in everyone who smells them. Maybe you stand in a graveyard and you consider the memories of the bodies being buried underneath your feet. Maybe you consider the way in which cultures are built on the dead, the ways in which my embodied experiences are passed down in my DNA, my cultural memory, my tribe, our common humanity. These notations should be thorough and detailed, writing both the seen and the unseen, the heard and the unheard, again, through all the embodied senses. So when I lead students through these methods, which I do frequently, I just did it actually last Thursday night for my graduate class, we attend to all the ways in which experiences begin with embodied knowledge, visiting and observing various field sites multiple times, engaging in systematic introspective recall. And so these are multi-sensory experiences. And so you might utilize a stream of consciousness notation, both in real time, while you're in the field, and retrospectively, of everything you see and don't see, everything you hear and don't hear, feel and don't feel, taste and don't taste, smell and don't smell. And so you want to focus on each sense for a period of time. You want to attune to specific sensory details such as colors, shadows, location, proxemics, size, shape, loudness, pitch, tone, tempo, so on and so on. And the purpose of this is to encourage revelation of a variety of stimuli and develop the ability to see familiar things in novel ways. And so we're going to practice this with you today. So you were asked to come to this webinar with a specific research project in mind. And so I'm going to take you through, I'm going to ask you to play along. We can't see you on the webinar, so we're going to ask you to play along. We're going to take just a few minutes and take you through a visualization exercise to help you engage in a sensory manner with your data. So whatever study you brought is a good study to use, whatever study you brought to the webinar. So if you brought a quantitative project, maybe you want to, as I said earlier, consider a piece of the data, consider something maybe you have some questions about, consider something you'd like to deepen your understanding of. So maybe you're going to consider a graph or a chart or a statistical finding. Maybe you're going to consider responses to a survey question. If you're a qualitative researcher, maybe you're going to consider some of the interviews you conducted, or maybe you're going to consider an observational field site that you did. If you're a cultural studies researcher, maybe you'll consider some mediated experience, a TV show, film. Maybe you'll consider, if you're a researcher who studies artifacts, maybe you'll consider a specific artifact. But I'd like to ask you to play along with me for a few minutes. And so I'm going to invite you to just sit there and relax and close your eyes. Again, we can't see you, so you're in a very safe space. And so I'd like to ask you, when we're done, I'm going to invite you to take a few minutes to jot down ideas. But right now, I just want you to close your eyes and not write anything down. So close your eyes, take a few deep breaths to get yourself into the experience. And I invite you to see this experience as if you're watching a movie. So just look around, notice who is there. What do you see? What objects are there? Are you inside, outside? What do you hear? What sounds do you hear? Then I want to invite you to step into the picture so you are there in the scene. Look around again. Who is there? Are they close, far away? Maybe pull them closer. Move closer to them so you can see them. Can you see clearly? Make it more clear if you need to see what's there. Is it bright? Is it dim? Maybe make it brighter. Who's not there? What's not in this scene? What sounds do you hear? If you can't hear them well, make them larger. Are they voices? Are they sounds of nature? Are they loud, soft? clear, muffled? What do you feel? Is it hot, cold, hard, soft, smooth, rough? What emotions, what feelings and emotions come over you as you're in this scene? Do you feel happy, sad, overwhelmed? What memories is this evoking for you? And then if you just reopen your eyes, and we might, in a classroom setting, or if I'm doing it with myself, I might take 30 minutes or more to do this. We just did it for a couple minutes. But pull a piece of paper and a pencil and just write down a stream of consciousness. Describe what it was you saw. Jot down the details you can see. Write about the details you can't see. Write about who the people are, what they're like, what the social dynamics are. What's the mood? Use as many details as you can, just free association. And I'll just give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll move on. All right, we're going to move on, and I apologize to those of you that are still writing. I can't see you, so I don't know who is still writing. But this is an exercise you can, as I said, do on your own or do with students. When I do this exercise with students, I might invite them to write a narrative, write a story, journal with a prompt, wow, look at, and then describe what it is they're seeing. Again, you can use this with quantitative data or qualitative data. You can use this with interpersonal data, as well as mediated or artifactual data. So what you're trying to do, the purpose of this first step, is to immerse yourself in your data so that you can see things that aren't obvious, that aren't obvious at your initial going through your data. So the next step then is to access emotion, or maybe you even want to call it transcendence, to transcend words and pull yourself into the experience through your emotions. And so you want to be as intentional as much as you can about putting yourself in the position of the people you're studying. Ask yourself what emotions you would have had if you had been in this experience, in this situation. Filter these emotions through your own emotional recall. And so you can journal in this stage. You can write poetry. Sometimes I will invite students to write poetry, and the poem that opened this webinar came from an exercise like this. The act of writing poetry is meditative, and it allows us to get to the essence of meaning and understanding. And so you're trying to approach a more emotive understanding of the experience. So go back to your emotional understanding as you were there, if you're an ethnographer or a researcher that's in the field, and then your emotional understanding now as you've been removed from a period of time from the experience. And so this might be a meditative attentiveness to stream of consciousness, unconscious feelings. Maybe you're asking the question, what am I feeling right now? kind of doing an emotional meditation leading to contemplation of the experience. And so we are not going to take the time to do this right now, but this is something I do with students again. And so I ask them to kind of write about this. Wow, I feel so whatever. And just ask them to describe what they're feeling. Write down their emotions that you can feel, the ones you can't feel. Because remember, this rhetoric of silence, what you don't see, what you don't hear, what you don't feel, sometimes is as important as what you do feel. Who or what are involved in these emotions. And so I asked them to do details. And some students write poetry in response to this, others write prose. Sometimes this is a classroom exercise. Sometimes I assign it and have them do it through student journals. Sometimes I have them share their journals with each other. Other times it's more private. And so then the third step is what I call contemplation and reflection, in which you make an attempt to more deeply understand the meaning of your experience through intentional contemplation and meditation. And so this involves an iterative and reiterative process of writing, considering, and reflecting on the ways in which this experience connects with other times or places in history, theories or concepts, social roles, area of focus, or stories. And so you're not analytically debating these concepts. This stage rather is more thoughtful, contemplative, and reflective. Lets you consider multiple positionalities, multiple intersectionalities to move your research from the immediate experience into the larger social, personal significance. And so in this stage, you're engaging in what Laurel Richardson calls writing as a method of understanding. And so through writing, Buddy Goodall talks a lot about this in his research. Through writing, you are letting the understandings, the deeper significance come out. Sometimes you can do it through collaboration. I do a great deal of research with a cultural studies colleague, Dr. John Crane, and he and I have written a lot of things, quite a few articles, and working on a book right now, in which we are pulling both the macro and the micro. So I tend to be looking at the more micro level, interpersonal, as I said, artifactual research, where he's looking at the more macro level. And so we put this together, and we're able to pull in and out and understand both the detailed sensory and feeling experience, and then pull back to see the more the larger cultural significance of what we're looking at. And so in this lateral thinking exercise, for instance, and I took my students through this just a few days ago, what you're trying to do is, again, go beyond the obvious to look at things in more detail. So I'll ask students, and you can have any series of areas you want to look at. But I told students, all right, so in your research, brainstorm what's 5 or 10 times in history that might be relevant to this research. What's 5 or 10 communication theories that might be relevant to this research? What's 5 or 10 social roles that might be relevant to this research, 5 or 10 places in history, 5 or 10 areas of focus. And then what I did was I just randomly gave them numbers. So I said, okay, first student, you're going to look at the 3rd, the 2nd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 7th. Items, and then they circle them. And so this makes you consider. So in this example here on the board, so you just might ask yourself, is there a way that structuration theory can help us understand dyadic communication involving a chaplain in Los Angeles in the future? And consider that and ponder that, maybe journal about that, meditate on that for a while. And that doesn't work for you, then go back and randomly circle another 5. So is there a way to consider how systems theory might help us understand groups and teams in the hospital, again, involving the chaplain in my childhood, perhaps. And so use whatever columns, whatever categories work for you, but let this exercise make you think outside the box, make you think about connections and things and significances that might not be readily obvious to you. And so this answers the so what question that should be asked of all of our research, of course, but can be considered to think about what does this understanding mean to us today, and how can we use this knowledge to advance a progressively significant future? And so students might be doing this brainstorming. Another thing that students might do in this same step is do a mind map. Again, we did this the other night, and I was really excited. I put my students through this exercise, and then I met with them individually. They're at the point in the semester where they're getting ready to write up their research, and so I met with them to talk about their research projects. And the ideas that students got out of the lateral thinking exercise and the mind map exercise was really, really exciting and powerful. And they thought of things that they said they would never have thought of had they not gone through these exercises. And so you guys are probably familiar with a mind map, but you start in the center with your topic, and then you do one level of go around. So you say, what's connected to this, what's connected to this, what's connected to this, what's connected to this. So if you're studying life-sustaining machines, being both dead and alive is connected. This comes from my Living Children's Hospital research, in which we're looking at the one of the things we're looking at is the ethical dilemmas of life-sustaining machines for infants and newborn babies. So both dead and alive, what is this related to the undead? What's that related to zombies? Life-sustaining machines, what's that related to? It's related to miracles. What's that related to? Life that wasn't possible before, and redefining what it means to be alive. Every single one of these nodes could be a separate paper, and it's connecting ideas in ways that's not obvious, and can be very significant and very interesting. So students ask, how is this phenomenon? What is this? How is something like the phenomena I'm studying? What if the phenomena were that time in history? What are the similarities? Sometimes it's a contemplative exercise in the classroom. Sometimes it requires going out and studying times in history or certain theories. But what it does is it helps you, both of these exercises help you identify connections and inspirations. And then the last step is one of dialogue. So you engage in dialogic conversations with other scholars, with study participants, with gatekeepers or informants, with other students, with hallway conversations. And every single one of the scholars I studied in my conversations book engages in some form of dialogue, whether it's a formal research group or a research team, whether it's conversations with their research participants, whether it's conversations with other scholars, whether, as I said, it's hallway conversations to run an idea past someone who can invite you to a different way of looking at it. But you're moving your contemplation then at this stage from your individual mind to a communal understanding about the significance and meaning of your work. And then, of course, you want to take part in interpersonal dialogue, but in addition to that, you might consider engaging in a dialogic understanding with your research. So as you seek to understand it at a deep level of meaning. And so you're intentional about moving internal, external, internal, external. You want to listen, hear, understand, engage at a deep level of understanding between you, your other researchers, the field, the area of study. So dialogue, as I know you as communication scholars know, is a communicative activity. It bridges space and time, culture, experience, thought, and emotion. So in conclusion, and we'll move on to see what questions you have of me. So in my work, I suggest it's the combination of these four practices, the embodied, the emotional, the contemplative, and the dialogic, that takes my scholarship to a deeper, more interconnected level of meaning and understanding. It enables me to interact with my research in a way that critically explores a significance that transcends anything that's just personal, just political, just partial. Lets me go analytically deeper than I ever would have otherwise. It lets me contemplate my own blinders, my areas of privilege, and lets me see insights that I would not have seen otherwise. Certainly that moved me beyond descriptive or theoretical data analysis. And it moves us into a level of existential understanding. And so you might ask, as you're moving through your data, you might think of it this way, asking Sharmaz's grounded theory question, what's going on here? Then you move through and ask the social constructionist question, what does this mean? Then you maybe ask the monk's question, where does it connect us to, and where does this connect to us? You might ask the critical scholar's question, what does this call into being? And so lots of scholars talk about embodiment, the knowing that emerges from your body. I'm suggesting an approach that extends embodiment beyond just the body to an emotive, contemplative, and dialogic approach to find this spark of understanding that transcends words, kind of to find our North Star, the place that we connect in our shared understanding and enlightenment of perspective and intuition of experience. And so I'm open to questions, thoughts, and comments. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much, Christine. I do have several questions here from viewers. Is there a worry that students will get overwhelmed by introducing so many meta-theoretical paradigms?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to talk about a couple different classes I teach. So I teach, as I presume you know, I presume you guys are familiar with my methods book. This book right here, Straight Talk About Communication Research Methods, and it's a survey course of research. And so certainly the goal, at least at our university, is to cover all types of methods that are used in communication studies. And of course, students only get a little piece of that. And sometimes in that class, our book certainly talks about holistic ethnography as one of the types of methods. And so we pull it in when we talk about qualitative research. Students are getting a little taste of all the different meta-theoretical positions anyway. And so all this does is teach them to appreciate all the different methods. It isn't giving them anything they're not already doing. So the class I'm using it in this semester is a class on end-of-life communication, and students are collecting their own data. So they came in knowing the different meta-theoretical perspectives we talk about in communication theory and research methods. And so this isn't teaching them anything new. It's teaching them to think about them in more appreciative ways. Certainly you can't, so sometimes people will ask me, and the research methods, especially with our book, how can you teach all the different methods? All you can do is in that class, all you can do is introduce students to them, help them to appreciate each method, and especially, I think the one most important thing out of that survey of research methods class is for students to understand the strengths and limitations of each method and to understand when each method is appropriate to use. And so this holistic method really just takes that to the next level by helping them appreciate the different ways of thinking. Thank you for that question.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks for answering it. How can we design a short survey to measure our students' meta-theoretical paradigms?
Well, there's an interesting question. Now, the book actually has a kind of, you might be a qualitative researcher if, you might be a quantitative researcher if, and it's fun to do. I kind of go through that quick. It's a table in our book. I go through that quickly with students. What I find is that students, it feels like they're doing a personality test. Students aren't just one meta-theoretical perspective or another. So we're not talking about is a student a post-positivist, although certainly there's probably personality types that correlate with that. But what we're talking about is, does a student understand that when they are doing work that comes from a post-positivist perspective, this is the way, these are the ways of seeing the world that are inherently attached to that perspective and those methods, versus these other ways of seeing the world that are inherently attached. So it's not as much where is a student as much as can a student understand the differences and similarities and come to an appreciation of that.
Excellent. What's your students' experience been like using this approach?
Well, so as I said a little while ago, I do this with students many semesters, and it really helps them. You know, students come through public schools into college, even now into graduate school. I teach a lot of graduate students without knowing how to think. Students can't write a paper without you're telling them exactly what it's supposed to look like and exactly what they're supposed to say. You have to outline it for them. I don't do that, but that's what they want you to do because that's what they've done through high school. And so what this method does is teaches students to trust that voice inside them that gives them ideas and helps them see connections. And it gives students a way to think and ponder and consider. It's exciting because they start listening to that intuitive voice inside of them, that voice inside of all of us that knows these things, but we don't listen to. And so it's a really exciting experience for students, and it helps them generate ideas that they would not have generated otherwise. And it's something they don't get in every other class.
Sure, absolutely. And I know you had touched on this in the beginning of the presentation, but how is this method truly different from triangulation or crystallization?
Well, that's a great question. So as I said, each of triangulation and crystallization each come from their own paradigms, their own epistemological ways of seeing the world, and are in those paradigms. What I would say is that both triangulation and crystallization are suggesting to us that we can broaden the way we see things, broaden the data we collect, broaden the way we understand it. What this method, what a holistic method suggests, is we can deepen the way we see things. We can see more deeply. So this might be more linear, or not linear as in step, but a more rather than going broad, we're going deep.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you. I have one other question. One of the viewers wanted to know if you're aware of a handout with the different research paradigms depicted as pieces of a puzzle. They thought that might be a good exercise.
I am not aware of that handout. I like that a great deal. It's a good idea.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the lateral exercise that you had mentioned. I think that's very useful for everyone. So once again, all the attendees, this will be recorded. I'm going to be sending you a copy of that in the coming days. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate your attention this morning or this afternoon.
Great. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the week, all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.